So I always give everyone a little bit of a background of why I'm here at a Global Health Conference talking about breastfeeding, and really why we need to be talking about breastfeeding at all, because in fact it should be a no-brainer. Why we have to study it so much and have statistics about it so much and prove that it is the best. It is not in fact the best. It is normal. It is what is. And everything that is not is not. So I'm going to be giving you lots of statistics today, not lots, a few statistics, but you should already know these things, and that's not what we're going to emphasize. We're going to emphasize why it's so important when we're dealing with global health. The reason this came out originally is that Sarah Pirtle had a group of students that was going to go on a global trip somewhere, and what happened was they, everyone wants to bring things. Oh, let's get samples of medicine, and let's get samples of this and that, and oh, let's bring a bunch of formula to these countries that don't have sustainable formula. And people didn't understand why that's a bad idea. And I hope after today you'll understand why that's a bad idea. So we're going to talk about breastfeeding, and I say it's the most effective way to positively impact global health. I would contend that, yes, it is the most effective and the most cost-effective, because, in fact, it is free. So, newborn life is fragile. About 4 million children die every year within a month of their first birthday. And health risks to newborns can be minimized by quality care, safe delivery, and strong neonatal care. Okay? So that's the beginning. But part of that strong neonatal care is support and promotion of breastfeeding immediately after birth. And that starts with good skin-to-skin contact. I always start out with this question because I know students are used to quizzes and everything. So how many children under the age of 5 are going to die in the next 24 hours from preventable causes such as diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria, and HIV? Guesses? Obviously, this is very casual, so feel free to yell out. Anyone?
No. A.
D.
Oh.
30,000 children a day will die from preventable causes globally. 30,000 children a day. HIV/AIDS gets a huge press globally, right? We hear a lot about it. We hear a lot about trying to prevent this, and of course it's important. And that's one of the things I added to the lecture today. I have a lot of slides about breastfeeding and HIV, and I think that's an important topic that over the years I haven't gone into great detail about. But today we're going to talk a little bit more deeply about that and how things are changing. But I want you to know the spectrum of the issue. When you deal with how many kids are dying, only about 500 are from HIV/AIDS. 2% of preventable deaths are caused by HIV/AIDS now, globally. I will tell you, just a few years ago, 10 years ago, that was 4%. Why? Because now they have improving access to antiretrovirals and appropriate feeding information and support for moms, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we are making good progress in terms of decreasing the rate of death due to HIV and AIDS, and some of it is actually directly related to breastfeeding. Okay. So what we need to understand is that poor nutrition generally is going to impact children with infectious disease, and over 53% of children who die of infectious disease the risks are being contributed to by their malnutrition. In Africa, 50% of children with severe malnutrition die during hospital treatment due to inappropriate care. And 25% of preschoolers suffer undernutrition, resulting in diminished mental and physical development. The thought is that inappropriate feeding of infants and young children are responsible for about 1/3 of global malnutrition. So it's inappropriate feeding, not just access to food, but people not knowing, not using what's appropriate. So this is the toll of malnutrition. It looks at all of the causes of HIV, of the deaths, HIV/AIDS, pneumonia, diarrhea, prematurity, malaria, birth asphyxia, and all these things. 8.8 million deaths, children under 5, 35% are associated with malnutrition. Another very busy slide from WHO from 2011, basically saying the same thing, showing us, I just had it was a little more colorful, so I threw that one in. And then this one breaks it up into causes of death for neonates versus children. And what you can see is the infections and pneumonia are huge for neonates. And then all the infections continue on as kids get over, out of the neonatal period. And it's infectious disease that breastfeeding can positively impact, especially, as well as developmental outcomes. So the question is, how many deaths are preventable purely by early and exclusive breastfeeding? The answer is 4,500, or 15%. So we talked about the total number of deaths for HIV/AIDS being 4% down to 2%. But 15% could be prevented just by breastfeeding, which again costs what? Nothing. Nothing. So this is a busy slide, but this shows us this statistic. Exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months will prevent 13% of the deaths. If you go down, immediate skin-to-skin is another 2%. Continued breastfeeding with complementary foods for 2 years, 6%. So it's actually more if you consider all of the things related to breastfeeding than that 15%. Do you know what the recommendation is for breastfeeding globally? How long we want people to breastfeed? You can throw it out there. What's the age? What's the WHO recommend? Well,
6 months exclusively?
6 months exclusively, absolutely. And?
Up to a year? Or as long as they desire?
No, that is the AAP recommendation, the American Academy of Pediatrics. The United States is the only country in the world that has its own breastfeeding recommendation. Why? Because in the United States, we don't need breastfeeding, because we're really smart without it. Is that true?
No.
No. What does the WHO say? The WHO says 2 years. Okay? 2 years. And it is not up to 2 years and stop. It is 2 years and as long as mom and baby want to breastfeed. Why? Because we have evidence that, in fact, not only is it, of course, perfect nutrition with the appropriate complementary feeding, but we have evidence even through the 4th year that there is decreased risk of death from diarrheal illness through the age of 4. So in the United States, the idea that a child turns 1 year old and all of a sudden breast milk is water, all of a sudden breast milk has no protective factors, all of a sudden that child is too big for mommy's milk, is a ridiculous statement. It is ludicrous. And the United States of America is the only country that has its own politically correct breastfeeding recommendation that is not based on evidence whatsoever. It is based on cultural weirdness. That's my own term. It's cultural weirdness. Okay? Do you know what the physiologic age of weaning is? And do you know how we know this? Physiologic age of weaning is somewhere between 4 and 7. Why do we know this? Your ability to break down milk sugar, lactase, if you look at your lactase activity, it takes a huge hit. It goes down at when? At your physiologic age of weaning, which is when? Between 4 and 7. So in fact, globally, we consider breastfeeding normal through the age of 7. I know people are like, oh my God, they're walking up, they're asking for it, it's disgusting. Okay, again, cultural weirdness, right? I will tell you in my practice, and I have an unusual practice, because my practice, I have 99% initiation, I have 60% exclusive breastfeeding at 6 months, which to me is still not good. It should be 99% at 6 months. There should be that 1% that maybe really didn't make 100% of the milk, but it should be 99%, so I'm not tooting my own horn. And why is my practice so awesome? Not because of me. It's because people self-select. Because what is my practice called? Naturally Healthy Kids, Pediatric and Breastfeeding Medicine. So someone who doesn't want to breastfeed is not likely to go, that sounds like the great place for me. I'm going to run down the street and see that breastfeeding lady who, is going to kick me out when I show her my bottle of formula. No, I don't do that, I promise. And I do have formula feeding kids, and that's a different story altogether. We're going to talk about that. But I bring all of this up because I want you to understand that we live in a country that is a great country. But our country still has human beings that are no different than any other human being across the world. We are the same people. Our physiology is the same. Our needs as infants are the same. And every infant deserves that. And that's why it's cultural weirdness. There's no evidence for it. And remember that recommendation. So when people give people a hard time, you're still breastfeeding at 15 months? Well, the WHO recommends 2 years and beyond. I have to remind parents of that all the time because that's the issue I have in my practice. People come in, they're still breastfeeding at 18 or 2 years or 18 months, not 18 years, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, and they're getting all this, slack from their family, and I just say, just remind them what the recommendation is and go about your business. So, very interesting. But if you look at a lot of these other things, and I just left this up here because even providing zinc and Hib vaccine and measles vaccine, and those are all really important things. But none of them combined even come to the effectiveness of breastfeeding. If every baby were exclusively breastfed from birth to 6 months, an estimated 1.5 million lives would be saved each year. Not just saved, but enhanced, because breast milk is the perfect food for babies' first 6 months of life, and no manufactured product can equal that. That's from UNICEF. And this is a beautiful breastfeeding stamp from Tanzania. What else does our country not have? A beautiful breastfeeding stamp. We do not have a beautiful breastfeeding stamp, or I would have put ours up. We need one. It's beautiful. Come on. So, but this is true, and I think this is the other cultural weirdness I'm talking about. In the United States, we're like, it's a cultural decision. It's a personal choice. If I hear one more person talk about personal choice, I'm going to punch them in the face. Because it's not a personal choice if it's not an informed choice. And the problem is it's not an informed choice. If someone truly knew what I knew about breastfeeding and then said, the hell with it, I'm just going to feed this kid formula, that would be an informed choice. Do I think it would be the right choice? No. But you know what? Then I could respect them and say, you know what? If you really take the needs of whatever it is, whatever reason you feel you need to feed formula over all of these things, that is your choice. Or in the situation where a mom has extremely bad postpartum depression and every time she latches the baby on wants to kill it, yes, the benefits of breastfeeding are certainly outweighed by the risk to that baby of the mom killing it. And in that case, the baby should not breastfeed. So I'm not ridiculous, but I think we need to make sure people are making informed choices. So why do we want you, if you go out and about in the world, to be supporting this on a global basis? Obviously, it's low-cost, high-quality food for children. It improves health and increases infant survival up to 6-fold. It improves maternal recovery and reduces cancers. It lowers expenditures for family. It improves micronutrient and protein energy status and increases worker and student productivity. Everything. It does everything. And again, it's not just low cost, it's free. It's free. It also contributes to fertility reduction. When you're breastfeeding, you have natural family planning. We hear about natural family planning. LAM, the lactational amenorrheal method, which was described by my friend Miriam Labach, is an excellent form of contraception, and it relies on exclusive breastfeeding.
But really, I clearly remember when I was in the Dominican Republic,
Mm-hmm.
I like seeing a woman with babies at both breasts and pregnant.
Yes, so it's not 100%, but if they're using it appropriately, if they're actually doing the method, it actually is shown to be as effective as oral birth control. However, there are tenets to it. To be a candidate for lactational amenorrheal method, number one, your period cannot have returned. Some women get a period in 4 weeks. You cannot rely on LAM for them. Okay? You also have to be breastfeeding full time. So a lot of women in the United States it doesn't work for because we go back to work and we're pumping. That doesn't count. You cannot rely on LAM if you are pumping and not breastfeeding 24 hours a day. When babies are weaned overnight, also. And it's only a 6-month period. Okay? Lactational amenorrheal method works for 6 months unless periods have not returned, and after that point, a lot of women can still rely on it pretty well. But it's obviously one of those things if you're, if you don't want, if you absolutely can't have a baby right now, other forms of birth control are advised, especially in the United States. But when you look globally at women who are breastfeeding exclusively, their natural childbirth spacing is much wider than when they're not breastfeeding. The other thing, and I don't know what the feeding patterns are in the DR, do they do any kind of mixed feeding? Because that's the other thing. If you're not exclusively breastfeeding and you're not doing it 24 hours a day, it doesn't count either. So there are a lot of factors that we don't know about in that situation. But if you look globally, it does actually make a big impact. And we know that having children closer together is more dangerous for the mom and the baby. It's obviously safe in emergency situations. It supports the environment for all of us environmental activists. And it decreases absence in the workplace, too. When women go back to work and they breastfeed, their kids are healthier. They don't miss work as much. And this is, and we're going to get to more of this, if practice exclusively reduces growth factor and HIV transmission via breastfeeding. You go, what? This is crazy. And also improves micronutrient absorption and other benefits. So why do we say exclusivity? 6 months of exclusivity. The longer you can practice exclusive breastfeeding up to 6 months, which is when what? Why do we need to start solid foods at 6 months? Babies get through their iron stores that they are born with. One of the things we can do to encourage more iron stores is a little bit of delayed cord clamping. Okay? Delayed cord clamping will increase the blood that goes to the baby. But the other thing is that especially here, we think that prior to about 6 months, the infant's gut is open and more susceptible to antigens and allergies and things like that. The other thing is they really just don't need it before 6 months. But at about 6 months, the majority of women have kind of maxed out their supply. And because of that, babies need to continue to grow. And so they have a certain amount of supply, and babies need to continue to grow. So what does the baby need? The baby actually starts to need more calories. What are the best calories for a baby to grow? Carbs, fat, protein? Guess?
Protein.
Protein, thank you. So what is a better complementary feeding than, say, rice cereal? Do you think rice cereal is a good first food for a baby? Does it have protein? No. Does it have arsenic? Yes. Is it a good food? No. It should never be given to a baby as far as I'm concerned. It should be taken off the market in the United States. It is not what most people feed around the world. The more appropriate complementary foods need to be good sources of protein, iron, because they've gotten through their iron stores, and zinc. They also need zinc. What are the best sources of those? Meat. Yes, they can have meat at 6 months. Beans, lentils, legumes, iron-rich vegetables, avocado, squash, sweet potato, those sorts of things. Not fruits right away. What do fruits have? Lots of sugar. It's fruit sugar, but it's still sugar. So that's important. Back to exclusivity. The other thing is that there are protections that appear to be dose-related with regards to protection against chronic diseases. So protection against diabetes, certain leukemias, lymphomas, all those chronic diseases, obesity, it seems to be dose-related. Part of it also is that when you have breast milk, babies know how to deal with breast milk, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on formula, but I'm going to tell you that this is the truth. If there's any way to avoid contributing to malnutrition among thousands of third world infants and still make a buck, we will do our utmost to find it. In the meantime, please be patient. The formula companies would love for you to bring their products around the world, and they have done a huge job of marketing their products around the world. However, once again, in the United States, guess what? We allow formula marketing. The rest of the world, it is illegal. Because of the WHO Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, which, by the way, the United States helped to draft and signed onto, but does not abide by. Why? Because of American business interests. Why? Because of your Mead, Johnson, and Ross reps. That's why. It's not the formula I have an issue with necessarily, although we'll talk a little bit why I do have an issue with a lot of what they put in formula. It's the marketing that's so wrong. So wrong. They send unsolicited samples to people's doors. You know, if you ever get that, if you're ever having a baby or know someone has a baby and gets that, I'm going to tell you what you do with that sample. You don't bring it to the food pantry. You could, because there are people already on formula you might be helping. But here's what I'm going to tell you do to make a better impact. What you do is you mark up that can with a Sharpie. And you say, abide by the code, unsolicited samples, unethical marketing, and you pop it back in the mailbox, and guess what? They have to pay for the return postage. They paid to send it to you, and they paid for you to send it back. And that would get them the message if everyone did that. So we know that formula is not as good as breast milk. Breast milk is the only food perfectly designed for human babies. Obviously, cow's milk is designed perfectly for baby cows. It's amazing for baby cows. And no matter how many ingredients are added to formula, it will never be breast milk. Do you guys know, you've heard about this DHA and ARA and lutein and all this stuff. Okay, do you know where they get the DHA? And this is universal. You cannot find a formula in the United States that does not have DHA from this source. It comes from red algae. Red algae is toxic. But they managed to extract it, and somehow it's not going to be toxic. Do you think that's regulated by the FDA? No. Guess who regulates formula? USDA. It is a food. Even though it's made in a lab and they're extracting things from red algae, it is not regulated by the FDA. Do you know where they get the ARA? From soil fungus. Also, never been in the human food chain before. Not tested. But because they did their test that said if I put ARA in my formula, it's going to make these kids smarter, which was all, by the way, done by the formula companies, and very flawed research. It's never going to be breast milk. And we don't know. The other thing is, do you guys know about like beta-carotene? So like if I were to give a really heavy smoker large doses of beta-carotene in pill form, they would become toxic very quickly. If I were to give them the same amount of beta-carotene in the form of food, they would not be toxic. They would be perfectly fine. Why is that? Because human bodies know what to do with food. Human babies know what breast milk is and know what to do with it. But when you just take powdered cow's milk and put in some safflower oil and some soil fungus and some corn syrup, and then like basically polylysol and do this and shake it all up and make that beautiful brown substance that they drink and it stinks really bad. We don't know if it's doing the same thing. And we know that it's not doing the same thing. Why? Because we have worse health outcomes. And not only that, in the United States, it became so normal to feed formula that we started to think that how babies grow as formula-fed babies is what's normal. And we started telling our breastfed babies that they were too small. They weren't growing the way they were supposed to. Why? Because we were comparing them to formula-fed children who are not growing normally. Because again, breastfeeding is what? Normal. It's not special. It's normal. So we talked about this, the fabulous formula marketing. It's just crazy. And I actually purposely have that kind of out of focus, but she is pretty cute. So what are the real risks of formula feeding? Because we also, in the breastfeeding world, we get really tired of talking about the benefits of breastfeeding. Because once again, is there a benefit to urinating? Yes, it makes your bladder feel better. Is there a benefit to getting pregnant by natural sex methods as opposed to in vitro fertilization? Would anyone argue that having a baby by having to go to the lab is an improvement upon the natural way? No one would ever argue that, right? That is normal. Breastfeeding is normal. So what we need to think about is what is the risk of not breastfeeding? What is the risk of formula feeding? And the first thing I put on there purposely, because I get really tired too, especially if I tell people I speak at Global Health. Well, yeah, because breastfeeding is really important for those poor global health kids that are starving to death in Africa. But here in the United States, we're fine. We don't need that business. Well, no, in fact, the U.S., I put the statistic in on purpose, the U.S. infant mortality rate is 1.3 times higher for formula-fed children in the United States. Not in Mexico, not in Africa, not in China, Mongolia, in the United States. Okay? That is our neighbors. Look at SIDS deaths. Your risk of dying of sudden infant death syndrome is twice as high if you're being fed a bottle. Do you know, I don't have the stat here, but your risk of dying of suffocation is higher if you're a bottle fed. What the heck is that about? Why should that matter? Why is it that when your breastfeeding mother has you in the bed with her, there actually is very little risk? And in fact, in Milwaukee County, there were 18 suffocation deaths in 1 year. And they had this campaign. I love scare tactics, by the way. This campaign was awesome. It was pictures of babies sleeping in bassinets with knives. Okay? Like, if you sleep with your baby, it's like sleeping with knives. I'm like, wait a minute. Let's look at this data. 18 deaths in 1 year. You know what they all had in common? Formula feeding. They were all formula fed. Not a single one was breastfed. Suffocation deaths. Why? Because when a mom and a baby, and I don't want you to walk away thinking that I think people who formula feed are evil people. I do not. I do not. But when a mom and a baby are not breastfeeding, there is no longer the same biochemical and physiologic connection between the two of them. Jim McKenna, who by the way is going to be here in August at the Olson Center Breastfeeding Conference, is amazing if you want to know more about this sleep stuff. He's done sleep data research. He's done videotape surveillance of moms and babies. What we know is when moms and babies who are breastfeeding are together, they share the same sleep cycles, so they sleep and wake at the same time. They're both much more arousable. When a baby is at the breast, the baby's saliva sends signals to the mom about what they need. The baby and the mother are a unit when they are breastfeeding. When they are not breastfeeding, they become separate. And there are risks to that, because our human bodies are not intended to be separate from another human at that age. Look at the risk of hospitalization for respiratory disease, 3.6 times higher. Leukemia, 1.3 times higher. Otitis, we all know this. And I always like this too. Well, I breastfed and my kids still had ear infections. Yes, that does not mean that if you breastfeed your child will never have an ear infection. These are statistics. And in fact, some people have bad anatomy. My 18-year-old had terrible ear infections when she was breastfed. And I always think, wow, I wonder what it would have been like if she hadn't been breastfed. She probably would have had tubes at 2 weeks. Childhood obesity, 1.3 times higher. NEC, and this is one of my favorite stats. Babies have a 2.4 times higher risk of getting NEC, necrotizing enterocolitis, in the NICU. Okay? There's a 15% death rate with NEC. It is an obvious correlation. They just finally, in the NICUs here in Omaha, are realizing that human milk is the only thing to feed micropreemies. And every nursery now does have donor milk if mom's milk is not available. Thank God. I mean, it's saving babies' lives all the time. But the sad thing is, the NICUs have a very narrow window of when they deserve donor milk. It's an interesting thing. They only deserve it when they're at the HACCRs. But of course, I would contend they all deserve it. GI infections, obviously, diabetes. Lots of things. And these are real health outcomes. You can look all of these things up and find more. I put this up because this is actually not just ear infections and the things, oh, they have more ear infections, blah, 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 isn't that nice? Lifestyle choice, blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, these are the kids that die. This is your risk of dying from these things. You have almost 11 times more risk of dying from dehydration. You have 15 times higher risk of dying from pneumonia. And then the incidence you can see in the next. But all causes of mortality, again, you are 14 times more likely to die if you do not have breast milk. And it's not just breast milk, it's breastfeeding. That's feeding breast milk in a bottle, which also, so the ABM is an international academy that I belong to, and they think it's the strangest thing in the world in the United States. All these women are just pumping and feeding milk like it's, oh, that's just so weird. And first of all, I've pumped. Pumping is terrible. Nobody wants to just pump. It's so much work, and you still have to bottle feed, and it's terrible. So I put this in here too because, again, people say, oh yeah, but those statistics, that's global, and in the United States, we don't need it. Again, I put these up specifically for this. This is in the United States. And these are odds ratio for diarrhea in fully breastfed and partially breastfed and all formula fed. And you can see that any amount of breastfeeding is protected, but what exclusive breastfeeding is most protected. And I just like that picture. So now why, you obviously know why I think that everyone should breastfeed. But what are the other issues with formula feeding in the rest of the world? And this is important, especially if you're dealing in emergency situations or situations where you are not having suboptimal, or you're not having optimal development, you don't have optimal infrastructure, that sort of thing, or if there's a crisis and you're in a refugee camp, that kind of stuff. You can have lack of water, poor sanitation, inadequate cooking utensils, shortage of fuel, daily activities taking up way more time, and again, uncertain, unsustainable supplies of breast milk substitutes is what that actually should say. Hopefully there's lots of supplies of breast milk as long as there are breasts. And lack of knowledge on preparation and use of artificial feeding. I think that that's really important. Again, if you get someone started on formula, but then you leave, mom doesn't have breast milk anymore, we can get her to relactate, but it takes some time. And guess what? It also takes knowledge to know that you can do that. And most moms wouldn't know that they could even do that if they didn't have someone tell them. So it's important to understand that it is not without its issues. Even if formula wasn't bad, it's not sustainable in those situations. And I put this up, and this is from UNICEF, but I mean, look at this chaos. Can you imagine trying to make a clean bottle in that situation? And guess what? You don't even have to wash your breasts. You don't have to do a thing. You just put them on there. In fact, if you wash them, it's not good. You want the baby to be colonized with your bacteria. It's another thing. So, quickly, what is optimal infant and young child feeding? 6 months exclusive. Feeding for 2 years and beyond, with appropriate complementary feeding starting at 6 months for those reasons we talked about. Making sure moms are getting appropriate nutrition, counseling, avoidance of unnecessary invasive birthing practices. That is something we are the worst for in the United States. Oh, Thanksgiving's next week, I'm due next week, but let's schedule a C-section this week or an induction. But guess what? I scheduled the induction before I was ready, and so it didn't progress, and I got a C-section. Do you realize that C-sections do not just affect the perinatal outcomes of that baby? And this is, again, a completely different subject. And this is my problem when I give lectures, because there are about 40 different lectures I could go off on, so I'm going to try not to do that. But C-section, babies who are born by C-section actually have also decreased health outcomes, even through the 3rd and 4th year. They have increased risk of asthma, allergies, diabetes, obesity, all sorts of things. And the mechanisms for those things are unclear. But at the ABM in Cleveland, there was a whole lecture about it, and I'm just going. And my oldest daughter, who was born by C-section, goes, "Mom, that's what's wrong with me." So I breastfed you. I did everything I could. The other thing, early initiation of skin to skin. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want you to understand that skin to skin is not just about temperature regulation and bonding. Oh, isn't that nice? Nils Bergman was the original researcher that came up with kangaroo mother care. He's from South Africa, and if you ever have the opportunity to hear him speak, he's amazing. He's like my hero. I love him. He was in a field hospital in Zimbabwe probably 40 years ago, and they had nothing but oxygen, and all these babies kept being born prematurely, and they just died, They just died. And he was like, what can I do for these babies? I have nothing. I have no money. I have nothing to buy equipment. I'm in this field hospital. And so he's like, I'm going to try this skin-to-skin thing and see what happens. So what he started was 24-hour skin-to-skin. Babies who were born were immediately put on mom's chest, skin-to-skin. He devised this T-shirt thing that actually kept the baby in place so they could get up, walk, go to the bathroom, do whatever. The baby never left mom's chest. Never left mom's chest. And just by doing that, did nothing else, the death rates were at least cut in half, and I don't even know if the cleared, I'd have to look up the statistics to be honest, but it was, I mean, it was earth-shattering. And what he's discovered as a neurobiologist and doing further studies is that when a baby is skin-to-skin, this plexus on our chest has more nerve endings than any other place on our body. And you'll see this with babies. If babies are fussing, you're like, oh, baby, grr, grr, grr. You go, zoom, and the baby settles down right away. That's where they want to be. Because when you have a baby skin-to-skin, you are actually able to co-regulate their nervous system. A baby who is on your chest can lift its head, can look at you, can push itself up. If you take a baby and put it on its own over there, it can't do that. But when a baby is skin-to-skin, it can. And the way Nils puts it is you have to wire new nerve fibers to fire. You have to wire to fire. So when you are doing those things, you are wiring new nerve fibers. You are stimulating that baby's neurological development in a way that no one else can. No other way can. Although dads can. Anybody's skin-to-skin works. So even if you have a dad, you get that baby skin-to-skin. If it's a C-section, if it's any of it. It's not about bonding. Oh, isn't that cute? It is about temperature regulation. They maintain their temperatures better. They maintain their glucose better. All of those things happen when the baby is skin-to-skin. And skin-to-skin contact should be encouraged for as long as possible, as often as possible, in that first 1, 2, even 3 months of life. It's very, very important. We talked about cord clamping. We talked about the complementary feeding and the birth intervals. So we briefly spoke on the code of marketing that we don't comply with here in the United States, but part of that code is no advertising or promotion to the public, no free samples, no donation of free supplies to the healthcare systems. All healthcare systems must obtain breast milk substitutes through normal procurement channels for sustainability. Very, very, very important when you're dealing with high-risk populations globally. And labels need to be in the appropriate language. We need to make sure things are being mixed correctly. This is wrong. It's bad. There are times where absolutely we need to do something other than breast milk because we don't have breast milk. Say the mother has died and we don't have anyone else able to donate milk or breastfeed that baby. Wet nursing has gone on for millions of years. People think it's so bizarre, but in fact, why is that any different than taking breast milk from a cow, putting it in a bottle, and feeding it to your baby? How does that not gross you out even more? I don't understand. Mother's very ill, obviously, sometimes temporarily if mother's relactating. And then the HIV thing, and I promise we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. And I hope you guys are okay with me going over since we started so late. Like I said, if anyone needs to leave, feel free. But I would need to be done right now if we were on schedule. Mother rejects the infant, or we talked about very rare cases where there's truly postpartum depression where nursing the baby makes the mom want to kill the baby. That is a dangerous situation, and I've actually personally had that in my practice. And even I said, where's the baby now? Who's with you? Give the baby to dad, walk away, have dad go get some formula, and stop breastfeeding. Because even the idea of pumping made this woman want to kill her baby. Or if people are dependent already on formula. Again, you must make sure the directions in the user's language. And believe it or not, despite what Ross and Mead Johnson would have you know, homemade formulas actually can be just as good, if not better, as long as they have the appropriate ingredients. So there are options for that. And in fact, even in the United States, I have moms who do make their own formulas. They're like, oh, it's crazy. And I look at the recipes and I look at the nutritional content, and a lot of them actually are closer to human milk than with formula companies, and it doesn't have corn syrup. Corn syrup should not be in infants' diets. It should not be in infants' diets, and that's a different lecture for a different day also, but there are lots of reasons corn syrup is a very bad thing for babies. The closest formula to human milk, nutritionally speaking, is actually one made by cow's liver. Sounds so disgusting. But if you actually look at it, it's pretty fascinating. All right. So, and this is just, you know, mom, blah, blah, blah. So also you need to make sure that things are easily clean. There's adequate fuel and water, a means of measuring, home lessons to make sure people know how to mix, and follow up with extra health care because it's really, really hard. So when you are promoting breastfeeding, you need to make sure moms have more time, that they have protection with shelter, and group them with other women who are in those situations, and then have availability of that support, and we're going to see that, instead of having free availability of breast milk substitutes. You can see, and this is a global thing, this was in Bangladesh, this is from 2000, so it's pretty old now, but it holds true today, it was that women who received support visits were much more likely to continue. And the best support comes from peer support, which is why it's really sad. The WIC peer support counselors here in Douglas County actually have made a huge difference in the high-risk population breastfeeding rates. And now the budget has cut them. And it's really sad because it was actually shown to be the most effective program through WIC to support, promote, and increase breastfeeding rates. But that's what our priorities are not. All right. So we're going to talk about preventing mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And this is a very controversial area. This is the reason I'm bringing it up, and I'm going to talk a lot more today than I typically do, because it's changing a lot, and I think over the years it may change even in the United States. So in July of 2013, WHO issued new HIV and AIDS guidelines on treatment for preventing mother-to-child transmission and on HIV and bottle feeding, breastfeeding, intended primarily for use in low and middle-income countries or resource-poor settings, and we'll talk about why. So the new treatment and infant feeding guidelines clarify treatment recommendations and emphasize placing pregnant women with HIV on treatment for life. So we're talking antiretrovirals. Okay? And this is, years ago we didn't have this as an option, so we couldn't even talk about it. So HIV and breastfeeding. For most babies, breastfeeding is without question the best way to be fed. Unfortunately, breastfeeding can also transmit HIV. If no antiretroviral drugs are being taken, breastfeeding for 2 or more years can double the risk of the baby becoming infected to around 40%. It is thought that 5 to 20% of babies infected through mother-to-child transmission acquire HIV infection via breastfeeding. Keep in mind that the other 80 to 95% are getting it some other way also, so it is not the only way. Breast milk does provide all the nutrients needed during the first few months of life, and it also contains agents that help against common childhood illnesses. We know about all this. So HIV-positive moms in low and middle-income countries are encouraged to breastfeed exclusively if there is little access to clean water, sanitation, and health services. Continue breastfeeding for 6 months and introduce complementary feeding and wean baby at 12 months and administer the appropriate antiretrovirals. So people are going, but you just said that they could get HIV from breastfeeding. Okay, but remember the other statistics. They're going to die from what? All the things that breastfeeding can prevent. So we have to look at the risk-benefit. There is a risk to both things, but which is more dangerous to the baby's survival? And in these situations, the more dangerous thing for the baby's survival is not breastfeeding. Okay? So there are 2 guidelines, and I'm not going to go into the exact details of these, option B plus and option B, but both of these options basically include these moms being put on antiretrovirals beginning in pregnancy, throughout breastfeeding, and throughout the rest of their lives. And the babies receive it also, and that's where I actually wanted to get to the babies. So the HIV-exposed infants born to HIV mothers receive a course of medication for PMTCT, which is linked to the drug regimen that the mother is taking. So the regimens are combined regimens, and the infant receives once daily nevirapine from birth until 6 weeks of age if they are breastfeeding. And then if they're not breastfeeding, they get it for 4 to 6 weeks. And the HIV-positive moms, okay, so this is HIV-positive moms in high-income countries. So this would be in the United States. So we're going to look at, these are the guidelines here. Avoid breastfeeding. Risk of HIV transmission is far greater than the risk of replacement feeding. That's the controversy. Is that true, based on what we've seen? What they're saying is that the risk of replacement feeding in the United States is much lower than the risk of replacement feeding around the world. Do you agree with that? I'm not sure. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer here. But this is the issue. So they recommend replacement feeding and also doing once daily nevirapine for the infant to reduce that risk that they would have been exposed during the birth process, or twice daily ACT. More to learn. So we're talking about all this, but what we know now, based on more recent studies, is that in fact breastfeeding is protective against transmission of HIV to the baby who is being breastfed. So while there may be risk, we know that there are HIV-neutralizing antibodies by B cells that are present in breast milk. And then in 2013, and the studies are here, there's a particular protein in breast milk that inhibits HIV. So not only is generally breastfeeding good against HIV, but there are specific things in breast milk that actually do protect the baby. So it just makes it even a more interesting story. We're learning more. So what's the trade-off? Obviously, we know breast milk contains everything that they need. Without being breastfed, an infant runs the risk of becoming seriously ill with diseases and dying. And similarly, unsafe and unreliable replacement feeding can make them at higher risk for dying. So that's why breastfeeding is highly recommended in these countries. The other thing is that women who are in a lot of these countries, if you don't breastfeed, people know you're HIV positive. So they're going to breastfeed whether they're HIV positive or not. So you need to make sure that they know the risk of what? Combined feeding is actually the most dangerous. And I don't have a good slide for that, but actually, women who exclusively breastfeed and follow the antiretrovirals, the risk of transmission is about 2%. Formula feeding is actually higher than that because the risk of transmission from other things is still high. But combined fed kids are at the highest risk. Why? Why? Because when you combine feed, just what we talked about, the gut is open. When you give a baby a foreign protein, it causes a reaction in the gut. The protection of the gut is no longer there. And where do we get the transmission? Through the gut wall. So when we start introducing formula to a baby who is also getting breast milk from an HIV positive mom, that baby is not able to protect itself from the HIV because the gut wall is compromised. So combined feeding is actually the most dangerous in the context of an HIV positive mom. So what's the answer? It's clearly shown that when antiretrovirals are taken through pregnancy and breastfeeding, there is a greatly reduced HIV rate of 2%. But there must be 100% adherence to taking the drugs correctly. Otherwise, there's a risk that the baby will become infected or resistant to the medication. So there needs to be a good support from mothers to help them adhere to an extended drug regimen as well as keeping to 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. So the reason I bring this up is there is not a clear answer, and it is not 100% one way or the other. But I will tell you that there is a huge contingency now in a lot of my colleagues who believe that the recommendations for the rest of the world, again, should be the recommendations here. That's the trade-off.
We need to wrap it up.
Yep.
Oh, perfect.
Ta-da! I'm good. I've had to squeeze things. I can make myself go fast. That's why I talk so fast. So obviously breastfeeding is the one practice that can have the greatest impact. Risk-benefit analysis, blah, blah, blah. You know this. The understanding of HIV transmission and breastfeeding is evolving and not always black and white. And future recommendations will very likely change based on new information and new research. It's an important public health issue with an impact that should not be underestimated, and global health programs need to be designed to promote, support, and increase breastfeeding rates to decrease morbidity and mortality and result in increased quality of life. What's strange is taking milk that was made for baby cows, chemically altering it, sticking it in a container designed to imitate a breast, and marketing it to the point that everyone thinks it's normal. What did I call it? Cultural weirdness? And my favorite, imagine that the world had created a new dream product to feed and immunize everyone born on Earth. Imagine also it was available everywhere, required no storage or delivery, and helped mothers to plan their families and reduce the risk of cancer. And then imagine the world refused to use it. I always close with this slide because it says a lot. There are several messages in this slide, actually. The breastfed healthy boy versus the skinny formula-fed girl, boy, girl, are both her children. Any questions?